office as president. We remind ourselves of his wife, Bess, a shy woman suddenly thrust into performing the duties of First Lady. And we'd like to recall, especially in election years, how he once told us that political experts can be wrong.
Along about 12 o'clock, I happened to wake up for some reason, and the radio was turned on the National Broadcasting Company. And Mr. Kelton-Barn was saying, well, the president is 1 million votes ahead in the popular vote. We have yet to hear.
I knew Harry Truman from my early days as a reporter here in Missouri. He lived with his wife, Bess, and his daughter, Margaret, in this house on now busy Delaware Street in Independence. He was a failed haberdasher who, in order to get ahead, had gotten into local machine politics. At that time, no one could foresee that he would become president or that he would permanently change America's course in the world, that he would leave us with the legacy of an exceptional term of office. Faced with an extraordinary series of crises, he responded with actions which endowed future presidents with a set of new and awesome responsibilities. Today, America's nuclear arsenal is under presidential control. At one word from this one man, 100 missiles would be launched, 1,000 new Hiroshimas created. Modern presidents defend the western half of Europe by keeping an American army on the ground and on alert, committed to this by solemn treaty. The president commands 40,000 other American soldiers south of Korea's 38th parallel to safeguard a truce in a war which has never officially ended. It is presidential policy to stand behind the statehood of Israel in a part of the world where many are dedicated to the annihilation of Israel. And today's presidents are committed to oppose communism wherever they judge it to be a threat to the security of the free world. All of these presidential precedents came from the administration of Harry S. Truman.
On behalf of teeny bikinis, skin-tight slacks, and backless backs, Carnation introduces the Do-It-Yourself Diet Plan. The safe, delicious way to get you back in the swim of things quickly. How much do you want to lose? 5, 10, 15 pounds? Suit yourself. Do it yourself with Carnation's new Do-It-Yourself Diet Plan. Because while they're looking at your suit, they'll be seeing you.
Gifts of gold or silver coins have almost always increased in value. Some of the silver dollars Grandma handed out are worth hundreds today. And a $10 gold piece given back in '32 could be worth thousands now. For the first time, you can give Olympic gold and silver U.S. coins. But these Olympic coins will not be made after this year. And while the Olympics will soon be over, Olympic coins will be cherished for generations. At many banks, coin dealers, fine stores, savings and loans, and post offices.
This is a recreation of Harry Truman's Oval Office at the Truman Library in Independence, Missouri. Ever since Truman occupied this office, every president of the United States has focused his foreign policy on a single crucial issue: preventing America and the free world from falling under communist domination. To carry out this mission, modern presidents have used a set of tools forged, for better or worse, by Harry Truman, who came into this office knowing little about foreign policy. By the time he was 39, Harry Truman did not think he would ever amount to much in the world. He had been a poor Missouri farmer who, when he tried his hand at business, usually failed. In one venture, his company gave up drilling for oil, just 15 feet short of hitting a major oil field. About the only endeavors in his life which had brought him success were his service in Europe as a well-liked artillery captain in the First World War. And after a very long courtship, finally getting his childhood sweetheart, Bess, to marry him when he returned from the battlefield. But after the war, when he tried his hand at the haberdashery business, that folded as well. He said he had the great knack of calling heads when tails came up. Accepting an offer from Tom Pendergast, the powerful Democratic political boss of Kansas City, Truman ran and was elected to a job overseeing the courts and rebuilding the roads in Jackson County, Missouri. Later, and again with Pendergast's backing, he was elected a United States Senator. During a second term in the Senate, he organized the Truman Committee, which was tenacious in looking for waste and corruption by the nation's war contractors. When Franklin Roosevelt decided to run for a fourth term, the respected Truman became Roosevelt's choice for vice president. He was called the Second Missouri Compromise. On April 12th, 1945, Truman was summoned to the White House, where he was told by Eleanor Roosevelt that her husband was dead. Harry Truman was now President of the United States. Truman took over the presidency with the Second World War still in progress and seemed ill-prepared for the enormous job ahead. He said the moon, the stars, and all the planets had just fallen on him, and he asked for the country's prayers. When the country prayed, it prayed not only for this untried man, it also prayed for itself.
Harry Truman was Vice President of the United States for a little more than 80 days before FDR died. And in that period, he saw the President of the United States, saw Franklin Roosevelt only twice outside of cabinet meetings.
William Lichtenberg, historian and author of In the Shadow of FDR.
He was never admitted into the map room where the strategy planning for the war was taking place. He was never allowed to know what was happening in the area of diplomacy to such an extent that, hard though this is to believe, he had never even met the Secretary of State, Edward Stettinius, whom he inherited when FDR died. And most of all, he didn't ever know anything about the atomic bomb.
As the atomic bomb neared completion, Hitler's Third Reich was in its final hours. On May 8, 1945, in office less than a month, Truman celebrated his 61st birthday by announcing the end of the war in Europe.
General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations. The flags of freedom fly all over Europe. I only wish that Franklin D. Roosevelt had lived to see this day.
2 months later, in July, Truman was in Potsdam for his first summit meeting with Churchill and Stalin.
Churchill was one of the most agreeable men I ever met. He's a hard bargainer. He likes to argue about everything, but when it comes right down to brass tacks, he's always on the right side. Stalin at Potsdam, that's the only place I ever saw him, made a very agreeable impression upon me. He was easy enough to get along with. It was easy enough to make an agreement with him. Of course, I didn't know at that time he had no intention of keeping it.
Before he left for Potsdam, Truman had made the decision most people most remember. To bring a speedy end to the war in the Pacific, he'd given the go-ahead to drop America's secret weapon, the atomic bomb, on Hiroshima.
It was done on the theory that our troops were expecting to invade Japan in a very short time through the Tokyo Plain and on the southwest side of Japan also, and it was estimated that it would take about 1.5 million men to make that invasion, and in all probability there'd be 500,000 of them of casualties and 250,000 of them killed. And when we had this powerful new weapon, I had no qualms about using it because a weapon of war is a destructive weapon. That's the reason none of us want war and all of us are against war. But when you have the weapon that'll win the war, you'd be foolish if you didn't use it.
The message, Hiroshima bomb, reached Truman on August 6, 1945, while he was sailing home from Potsdam. Truman said, "This is the greatest thing in history." And then he addressed the nation.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. It was to spare the Japanese people from utter destruction that the ultimatum of July the 26th was issued at Potsdam. Their leaders promptly rejected that ultimatum. If they do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth.
3 days later, another bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, and it was all over.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government in reply to the message forwarded to that government by the Secretary of State on August 11th. I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
So another war to end all wars had come to a close. But to this day, the debate still rages as to whether or not it was absolutely necessary to drop the atomic bombs on civilian targets.
Truman has also encountered a fair amount of criticism for his dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan in the first summer that he took office. And yet even people who start out, historians of the New Left, to be critical of Truman, when they look at the actual situation that he confronted, the terrible bloodletting in the Pacific War, the fact that so-called conventional bombing had already taken so many lives, Truman's action does not seem as out of the ordinary as it might appear on first glance. What does continue to trouble people is that Truman showed so little concern about an action that had such devastating consequences.
He said one time, he said that after he made that decision, he slept just as soundly that night as he'd slept any other night.
In 1946, Clark Clifford became Harry Truman's special counsel.
Part of, I think, that of his ability was the concept of the fact that decisions had to be made. And with Harry Truman, if the area of disposition was that wide, it would result usually in about that much black and that much white. And he'd step right on in and he'd make it. Now, there have been other men I've known who, in the same area, would have a little white over here and a little black over there, and the whole middle would be gray. And they'd spend most of their time in the gray part. And if you don't make decisions when you're president, they get worse all the time. They don't go away. They multiply, and they multiply really geometrically and not arithmetically. We've had some like that, I believe, in the past. But he sensed that, and he made those decisions. He made some mistakes. But I've always been convinced the American people will forgive a president for making mistakes. They won't forgive him for avoiding making decisions.
Soon after the Second World War ended, as the Allies demobilized what had been the world's greatest military machine, the Russians, staying strong, began to bring one Eastern European nation after another under their control. In an attempt to enclose still more countries behind the Iron Curtain, the Communists in 1947 directed their attention to Turkey and Greece. In Greece, many of the communist guerrilla forces which had fought the Germans had now turned their guns on the Greek government in a struggle to take power. When the financially strapped British could no longer support the Greek government, President Truman stepped in to help. He asked Congress to send war supplies and military advisors to help defeat the communists.
Should we fail to aid Greece and Turkey in this fateful hour, the effect will be far-reaching to the west as well as to the east. We must take immediate and resolute action. The free peoples of the world look to us for support in maintaining their freedom. If we falter in our leadership, we may endanger the peace of the world, and we shall surely endanger the welfare of this nation.
This action to guarantee American aid to any free nation resisting communist propaganda or sabotage became known as the Truman Doctrine. It invoked the new idea of not only containing the communists politically, but militarily as well. The doctrine would be carried out again during Truman's 7 years in office.
In appealing to Congress, he went much further than I had thought it wise to go.
During Truman's time, George Kennan was a top State Department planner and authored the concept of containing Soviet expansionism.
My feeling, and I think that of the others in the Department of State, was that, yes, we saw reason to support the Greeks, but that didn't mean that we saw reason to support every other country in the world that might claim that it was threatened by communist minorities.
What was your concern over the escalation of the Truman Doctrine?
I did not feel that we should commit ourselves with a blanket commitment to try to help every government which could claim that it was threatened by communist pressures. I always felt that whether we could assume that role or not depended first of all on what that government was doing to defend itself. If it wasn't determined to defend itself, no outside force could do it. I used to say, I think, in those days that the only people who are really worth helping are the people who say to you, look here, we propose to succeed with this whether you help us or not, but it will be a little easier if you can give us some help.
The end of the Second World War left Europe devastated, with its industrial and agricultural capacity completely shattered, with its gold reserves almost gone. The continent was having a difficult time recovering. Russia, in no hurry to sign a German peace treaty, acted as though an unsettled Europe was advantageous for Soviet purposes. Truman perceived that without some kind of recovery, and soon, there was the potential for major political disruption, with perhaps more nations falling to the communists. Under Truman, a plan was drafted to rebuild Europe. It was named the Marshall Plan in honor of America's wartime Chief of Staff, General George C. Marshall, who was now Truman's Secretary of State. The Marshall Plan offered aid to any country, communist or not, to help them to economic health. The communist nations turned the offer down, and with it, an opportunity to participate in the recovery which was to become the European miracle. In a moment, how the United States began its involvement in the Middle East when CBS Reports continues with the legacy of Harry S. Truman.
A glimpse of the American presidency from General Motors. Because our Constitution gave the vice president so little to do, the men in that office tended to become anonymous, the office itself humorous, the butt of 1,000 jokes. But beyond the humor is the hard fact that on 13 occasions, a vice president has become the president, stepping forward to find his own place in history.
Detailed studies of the human body, biomedical research, computer-aided design, 2 years and countless clay models, trying different shapes, new materials, doing it over, again and again, all to design a more comfortable, durable seat for General Motors cars and trucks. Leonardo would have loved it. Nobody sweats the details like GM.
In this year's election, the state of the nation's economy will largely determine who wins this chair. People expect the president to shield them from hard times and to provide a climate which will put as many of them to work as possible. To do so, presidents have been fine-tuning the economy with a law passed under Harry Truman.
The immense industrial effort of the Second World War ended America's great economic depression of the 30s and brought the country to full employment. After the war, Truman was eager to continue the prosperity. He also looked forward to disappointing the Russians were patiently waiting for America's post-war boom to go bust. Truman sought a measure to help safeguard American workers against the loss of their jobs. He asked for the legal authority to adjust the economy when needed. The result was the Employment Act of 1946. The act made it the responsibility of the federal government to use all practical means to promote full employment, production, and purchasing power.
He recognized that everything that we do economically, everything that we do in a material sense, is done with goods and services. You eat goods and services, you wear them, you take vacations with them, you fight a war with them. So it would seem obvious in America that the most important purpose of economic policy would be to maximize or optimize the production of goods and services.
In 1950, Leon Kaiserling became chairman of Truman's newly created Council of Economic Advisors.
How did this fellow from Missouri, who had failed in his only small business venture, understand the complicated economics running the country?
Because he recognized that it wasn't complicated, and I'm not being facetious. When I asked Truman, when is unemployment too high, he didn't answer like other economists. He said it depends on whether or not you're unemployed. Truman had the essence of what a president needs in economic policy. A realization that the well-being of the people is the supreme law, that the economy exists to do things for the society, beginning with those who need help most, plus a supreme confidence, despite his early failure, that America, and he learned part of this from World War II, that America could do almost anything it wanted to. When I hear so much talk today about our being the nation of what we can't afford, Truman's attitude in contrast was we are the nation of what we must do.
In June 1948, Truman was faced with a crisis in the divided city of Berlin. A dispute had erupted between the Allies and the Russians over the type of currency each was to use in their zones of Germany. The Russians used the argument to block all land and water traffic to Berlin. The city was deep inside what we know today as East Germany. With Allied supply lines cut, the 2 million people of the blockaded city would be at the mercy of the Russians, relying on them for food and fuel. Truman was faced with a dilemma. To use force to get to Berlin overland through the East German corridor might have set off another war. To abandon the people of Berlin would have indicated that Western Europe had a weak ally in the United States. Instead, Truman elected to build a bridge of planes to Berlin. He mounted a massive all-weather round-the-clock airlift to fly in all the coal and food the city needed to stay alive. Brought in 4,500 tons of supplies each day. The airlift succeeded in keeping the western part of Berlin better fed than the east. 11 months after it began, the frustrated Russians ended the blockade and all roads to Berlin were open again.
At Potsdam, the agreement was that there would be four-power control of Germany, four-power control of Germany, each in its own zone. Once this four-power control began, of all people, the French threw the monkey wrench into the works.
Robert J. Donovan, former White House reporter and a Truman biographer.
The French were so fearful of a revived Germany that they, at every point, fought against any kind of centralization. They fought against, as I remember, centralization of the rails, of the mail. They just gummed up four-power control. From the start, it wasn't Truman, it was the French. Then, as things went along, the occupation became much more expensive than anyone had dreamed about. And Truman had seen what happened after the First World War, when the German occupation became a burden on American taxpayers. And he wouldn't have it, and that led by degrees to the bizonia, the merging of the British and American zones, which was, in the beginning, very largely an economic matter. By then, you know, we were in disagreement with the Soviets on so many points, particularly on reparations. They wanted to take factories and things out of our zone. Truman wouldn't agree to it. So the Berlin airlift, the Berlin crisis, did occur against the backdrop of gathering East-West enmity.
In 1948, with the demobilization of the Allied armies now completed, Western Europe was highly vulnerable to attack from the east. In an effort to achieve a balance of power, Truman moved to provide a unified defense force for the North Atlantic Allies. The result was the formation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was the first time America joined a peacetime military alliance.
There are those who claim that this treaty is an aggressive act on the part of the nations which ring the North Atlantic. That is absolutely untrue. For us, war is not inevitable. Men with courage and vision can still determine their own destiny. They can choose slavery or freedom, war or peace. I have no doubt which they will choose.
Truman returned General Dwight Eisenhower to Europe by appointing him NATO's first commander.
I devoutly pray that the mission on which I'm leading this morning will result in nothing but peace, security, and tranquility for our various nations of the Western Atlantic.
I agree with you, General, and I know that's going to be the result. You have the wholehearted backing of the people of the United States, and I know that you'll have that same backing from the 11 other nations who are in the Atlantic Treaty. Goodbye and good luck.
During these years, Truman came to grips with another tragedy caused by the Second World War. People without a country. Against the recommendation of his State Department, he decided to support the Zionist quest for a Jewish homeland in Palestine.
In 1948, Truman recognized the new state of Israel only 11 minutes after it became a nation. There had been nothing in his early life to suggest that Truman would be sympathetic to the Zionist cause. Historians found his early letters to Bess filled with anti-Semitic slurs. In 1969, Truman's former Secretary of State, the late Dean Acheson, told CBS News why Truman supported Israel.
We had over 100,000 displaced persons, mostly Jewish, in our military refugee camps at the end of the war. Here they were. They couldn't go back to Russia or Poland. They couldn't go back to Germany, where so many had been murdered. And wherever they had fled from, they had left forever. Now, what to do with them? It was our responsibility. We had them in our camps. Our military commanders were pressing the president. Various suggestions were made. Brazil at one time offered to take a good many. The president tried to get our immigration laws made more lax. In this he failed. And then he turned to Palestine. And at that time, the British quota was 1,200 a month, immigrants. Well, you got nowhere 1,200 a month with 100,000 and more coming all the time. So the president, with various commissions, pressed the British to admit the 100,000. And the Arabs said, if you do this, we have war. Finally, the State of Israel was created. We recognized it, and the 100,000 went in, and more than 1 million went in. Now, this was one great pressure that was on him, and this, I think, was the major one that moved him.
I remember about 10 days beforehand, he called me in and said, now we're going to have a meeting with General Marshall and Robert Lovett on the question of the recognition of Israel. And he said, I want you to study this carefully, remember all that we've talked about, prepare a presentation as though you were presenting a case to the Supreme Court of the United States. We met about 3 days before Israel was to announce. General Marshall opened at the president's request and gave the reasons why we should not recognize Israel. Then he was backed up by Mr. Lovett and the third man they brought over from the Middle Eastern desk. So they made their whole presentation. Then he said, now I've asked Clark to make a presentation. And I'd worked on it very hard. And I made it. Took about 20 minutes. And I gave all the reasons why we should. When I finished, General Marshall's face was absolutely beet red. I think he'd had grave difficulty in containing himself during this presentation. And the president turned to him and said, General Marshall. General Marshall said, I can't believe what I'm hearing. He said, in the first place, he said, I don't see why Clifford's even attending this meeting. Well, the president said, he's here, General, because I asked him. Well, he said, we're not interested in the politics of the situation. The president said, well, he didn't discuss politics in any way. Well, he says that's what's behind it. The whole thing's just a political presentation. He said, I'll tell you one thing, Mr. President. He said, if you decide this dispute and this question contrary to the recommendation that we're making, I'd have to tell you ahead of time I can't vote for you in the next election. And I was picking up my papers and going, and he said, well, he said, we had a pretty rough time. And I said, well, it isn't the first case I've lost and probably won't be the last. He said, you haven't lost it yet. Now, he said, let's give him a little time. Let's let the dust rest. The morning of the day that they were to become an independent state, at 4 o'clock that afternoon, General Marshall phones and says, we've been having meetings on this, Mr. President. And he said, I will not object now to the recognition of Israel.
You were opposed to the partition of Palestine as it was worked out.
Yes, as director of the planning staff, I produced a staff paper on the request, I think, of the Undersecretary of State. The report was warned against our supporting this actively, and especially by any use of American armed forces, and took the position that the Arabs had not agreed to this partition at any time, and we thought this carried us too far, that it would disrupt the whole pattern of our relationships in the Middle East, that it would put us in a long-term state of antagonism with all the Arabs in that area, and would create instability and would play eventually into the hands of the Soviet Union. We did underestimate the sheer military ability of a Jewish state to defend itself by force of arms.
Did you have any sense that there was any anti-Semitism in the White House?
No, I didn't feel that. And I think that probably, from all I know, that would have been unjust if applied to President Truman. This is, of course, a tremendously delicate and difficult question. You could ask the same question about the State Department, too. And when I look back on myself and others there, I don't think we were anti-Semitic. We were reacting to what we felt was an undue pressure from groups within this country, a form of pressure which we resented. But we felt the same way about the China lobby. You could say we were anti-Chinese, but it wasn't that. It was simply the way the political system was being manipulated that offended us.
In a moment, a political surprise and a difficult decision when CBS Reports continues with the legacy of Harry S. Truman.
Tuesday.
Stop the music! Stop the music!
Aftermash welcomes a well-intentioned new nurse who gives the entire hospital the runaround.
Doggone it, nurse, I had the light.
Then it's the return of domestic life.
What a country.
Where young Harold's at the bat.
Say bye-bye, babies.
For you, Ma.
Aftermash and Domestic Life, Tuesday.
This is CBS.
This is a Region 10 News Break, sponsored by Brazos Bank Savings and Loan. On tonight's late news following the convention, we will have a complete wrap-up report on Senator Gary Hart's keynote message to the Democratic Convention in San Francisco. And we'll also take a look at the results of tonight's tabulation on whether or not delegates choose to nominate Walter Mondale as their presidential candidate on the first ballot. Locally, the state's Attorney General office may be called in to investigate the Coppers Cove police suspension cases. So we'll have details on these stories and more news on Region 10 News on the late reports.
Brazos Bank now offers fixed-rate certificates with guaranteed interest. And you pick the term.
Homestead has just opened a lot in Lorena, Texas. Tejas manufactured homes. When stock is complete, we'll have 8 double-wide setup plus singles, trade-ins, and pre-owned homes. Until we're fully stocked, here's a sample bargain, a 1,230 square foot Fleetwood double-wide for $24,995, delivered, set up, and air conditioned. Homestead in Tejas has 8 of the top-selling manufactured lines in Texas. If you can't find what you want in Robinson and Lorena, it's probably not available. That's Homestead and Tejas manufactured homes.
The Democratic National Convention and Region 10 News is there, covering the Texas and area delegates with special reports fed daily via satellite. Region 10 News is committed to keep you informed. That's why we have a news team in San Francisco. After all, the convention is too important to trust to just anyone. CBS News is there, and so is Region 10 News, the #1 professionals. That's why, when it's important, Central Texas turns to Region 10 News.
Channel 10 in Waco, this is KWTX-TV.
1948, Truman, now feeling sure of himself in the presidency, decided to seek the job in his own right. He hoped that his election would rid him at last of Roosevelt's ghost.
He constantly had a sense in particular that the Roosevelt family was looking over his shoulder. Mrs. Roosevelt, to such an extent that he would write her letters, which, as one commentator said, gave the impression that he was treating Eleanor Roosevelt as though she were a medium who could bring back messages from the departed president. He was so solicitous of Mrs. Roosevelt that he and his family didn't even move into the White House for some weeks in order not to disturb her. And in 1948, Roosevelt's shadow was so strong that the 2 Roosevelt sons, Jimmy Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt, were the leaders of a movement to dump Truman and to deny him renomination for the presidency.
By convention time in Philadelphia, the Democrats were deeply divided, putting Truman's candidacy into serious trouble. One of the splinter groups, the Dixiecrats, walked out of the convention to protest the civil rights plank in the Democrats' platform. Truman wanted legislation to guarantee freedom and equality to all citizens. Later, he will become infamous with many by signing an executive order racially integrating the armed forces. Although more than a few delegates were only mild about Harry, he was nominated on the first ballot. Truman was certain he could win if he took his case for re-election directly to the people. He waged a whistle-stop campaign across America, his train taking him into hundreds of cities from coast to coast. His target was what he called the do-nothing, Republican-controlled 80th Congress. Usually, someone in the crowd would yell, "Give 'em hell, Harry." Truman would reply, "That's exactly what I intend to do."
This Republican Congress has already stuck a pitchfork in the farmer's back. You men of labor can expect to be hit by a steady barrage of body blows. And if you stay at home, as you did in 1946, and keep these reactionaries in power, you'll deserve every blow you get. I'd like very much to introduce to you the First Lady. This is Margaret.
And everywhere we stopped, they played "If I'd Known You Were Coming, I'd Have Baked a Cake." And then they put a cake on board the train. And I got awfully tired of that, and I was awfully tired of the Missouri Waltz, and I was very tired of "I'm Just Wild About Harry." They played those 3 things in one day 27 times.
Truman's Republican opponent was Governor Thomas E. Dewey of New York. 3 weeks before the election, the results of a Newsweek poll indicated 50 out of 50 political experts thought Dewey would beat Truman hands down. As the returns began to come in on election night 1948, Dewey, as expected, jumped into an early electoral lead. With everything seeming to fall into place, the Chicago Tribune rushed to press with what they thought would be the next day's headline. But as the slow counting of the returns continued, the tide of the election turned.
What did you sense about that campaign, whether it was going to be successful or not?
The crowds got bigger and bigger and bigger, and I really felt that Dad was getting across. I thought he was going to win.
You did think he was going to win?
Mm-hmm.
Do you think he thought he was going to win?
Yes, I think he thought all along he was going to win.
All along?
Mm-hmm.
So that election night wasn't a surprise?
No, and I was up all night that night because he went off and went to sleep, you know, in another small town. And so nobody could get at him. He slept all night long. And I stayed up all night and fenced with the press who were on the front lawn. They said, Margaret, we'll offer you anything if you just tell us where your father is. I said, nope, can't do it.
Well, I was on the front lawn. And we all thought he was in the house. We thought you were kidding us.
Did you really?
Sure.
Oh, dear, I'm sorry about that. I thought I came across as being very honest.
I stood right here on the 19th of February, 1948, and told you we were looking at the next president. Well,
every president of the United States comes into this office hoping to serve out his term without ever having to make the most terrible and lonely decision of all, to commit American lives to war. On June 24th, 1950, Harry Truman had to make such a decision.
Late on that Saturday afternoon, Truman, who was home in Independence, received word that the North Korean Army had crossed the 38th parallel in Korea and that a full-scale invasion of the South was underway. Truman knew the North Koreans would not have done this without the backing of the Soviets. He felt that if the invasion of South Korea was successful, Europe could be next. He then made what he would later call the most difficult decision of his presidency. Bypassing Congress, he went directly to the United Nations. With the Russians absent, the organization agreed to send a force to help the South Koreans. The UN command was headed by American war hero, General Douglas MacArthur. Truman took these steps without a declaration of war because he said he was concerned that if action was not taken quickly, the door would be open for worldwide Soviet aggression.
here was history repeating itself. Here was another probing action, another testing action. If we let the Republic of Korea go under, some other country would be next, and then another. And all the time, the courage and confidence of the free world would be ebbing away, just as it did in the 1930s. And the United Nations would go the way of the League of Nations. When I reached Washington, I met immediately with the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, and the other civilian and military officials who had information and advice to help me decide what to do. We talked about those problems long and hard.
Truman and his generation just lived by the lesson of Munich. In other words, you give them a little bit and they want more. Truman believed that a threat to the peace anywhere became a threat to the peace everywhere, which probably isn't true, I suppose, but he believed that. And therefore, he was very concerned, too, that Korea might be either a feint or just the first step. In other words, that what might come next would be in the Middle East. And if he didn't stop it there, as in the case of Munich, the Soviets would attack somewhere else. Oh, the lesson of Munich was the lodestar in Truman's outlook on the world.
In Korea, the unexpected happened when the Chinese communists sent in a huge army of so-called volunteers to help their allies in North Korea. As the war continued, General MacArthur publicly campaigned for permission to bomb Chinese bases in Manchuria. Truman called MacArthur's actions insubordination.
And I stood it as long as I could, and I made up my mind the best thing to do with him was to give him the McClellan treatment, that was to retire him.
The undeclared war was still in progress when Truman left office.
Was the action taken in Korea within your concept of containment?
What I meant by containment was that the war had ended up with a very considerable extension of the boundaries of Soviet power, both in Europe and in Asia. There's where Korea came in. And that what we should try to do was to see that those boundaries were not extended any further.
Do you think that the containment policy as it evolved under the Truman Doctrine left a legacy that perhaps spawned McCarthyism, JFK's, President Kennedy's inaugural pledge to defend democracy wherever it was threatened, and eventually Vietnam. Is that where it all began?
The word had this effect, rather than my own interpretation of it. Also, of course, it was immediately taken on the other side of the river as meaning military containment. And then it was taken by the political...
The other side of the river, you mean the Pentagon?
Pentagon. And by a lot of the Congress. And a lot of the press took it up this way, too. It was my own fault. I should have made it clear in the article that what I had in mind was nothing of that sort. It was something quite different. And I've always reproached myself from that. But there were two things, two distortions of this article. One was the idea that it should be applicable to every place in the world. And the second was that it was a military containment. And that has run through our experience in Vietnam. Also, it has to do with our problems today in Central America and in the Middle East. We're still contending with these two misunderstandings of the containment doctrine.
In a moment, his place in history, when CBS Reports returns with the legacy of Harry S. Truman.
A fresh coat of paint, new wallpaper, a few simple changes make a big difference. But now for the finishing touch, changing this old phone for a trim line beauty like this. I can do it because I lease my phones from AT&T. Leasing gives me the chance to upgrade my phones. Just call AT&T toll-free or stop by one of their phone centers. Now, how about that? Brand new look, still got an old reliable.
AT&T Consumer Sales and Service.
Gentlemen, your answers.
We agree. We disagree.
Republicans and Democrats traditionally don't see eye to eye.
Take the tunnel. Take the bridge.
Yet, despite their differences...
Turn here. Go straight.
Both parties, for the first time, have chosen the same airline for their national conventions.
American? American. After you.
Beneath this natural spring.
Charlie, this water tastes good.
No calories, neither. It's natural spring water. Starkist loves it, so I'm gonna give him some.
Star-kissed tuna in natural spring water. Mmm, delicious taste, but half the calories of tuna in oil. A measurable difference.
Pick up your spring water and a little surprise, Starkist.
Sorry, Charlie. Star-kissed tuna in natural spring water. Good taste, naturally.
By the time Truman turned this office over to Dwight Eisenhower in January of 1953, Eisenhower and his staff had been thoroughly briefed by the Truman staff between the election and the inauguration. It was the first orderly transition of the presidency in the nation's history. On inaugural day, when Eisenhower entered the Oval Office, he found a locked drawer in his desk. Getting a key and opening it, he found a folder left by Truman summarizing the major problems with which Eisenhower might have to deal immediately. Every president since has been given a similar folder, and indeed these briefings might all contain a section that could have come from the desk of Harry Truman.
Harry Truman is thought of as being a near-great president, and that's probably the reputation that he's going to bear. He managed to confront the Soviet Union, prevent the expansion of communism in Western Europe, and yet avoid any war, any new world war, notably through the imagination of efforts like the Berlin airlift. Harry Truman, at one point in his presidency, fell to a rating of only 23%, the lowest that anybody has ever had, lower even than Richard Nixon had at the bottom of the Watergate experience. And there were some reasons for that. And though historians never rated Harry Truman to that lowly, they nonetheless think of Truman as someone who used poor judgment in taking the idea of containment, which worked well enough in Western Europe, and giving it a global sweep, so that many of the seeds for the disaster in Vietnam were planted in the Truman years.
Truman was not, in my view, of the very first order of American presidents. He was not really intellectually equipped. That's an important virtue if it's used properly. He was not engaging in the sense that if you had him to dinner and didn't know he was president, you wouldn't think at the end of the evening that was the brightest, most interesting man in the room. You just wouldn't, you see. So he had these lacks as well as virtues. I don't want to give the impression of just going all out because I worked for him. But he was by far one of our better presidents.
I suggest to you that every year since he's left office, his reputation has grown, his standing has risen, and I wish I had $1 for every time in these last years of Watergate and Vietnam that somebody said, what wouldn't I give if we had old Harry Truman back in office?
A few final notes about Harry Truman. When he left the White House, he was almost broke. There was no presidential pension, no Secret Service protection, no money for a staff to help him with his papers. When he returned to this house in Independence, he was Citizen Truman, looking for something to do.
We're back home now for good. I'm in the army of the unemployed now, although it's a very small army, and I'm here to tell you that a little later on, when I get the job done that Mrs. Truman has for me, which she says I'm going to have to do, that's to unpack all our goods and chattels. And it took about 7 or 8 men 3 months to get it done, so I don't know how long it's going to take one man to get it undone. After that, I'll be open for dinner engagements and things of that kind, because I may be hungry for that time.
Harry Truman died in 1972. Since then, as our guests have suggested, history has treated him well. Although many people still think of Truman as the average man who history singled out to become president, there really was nothing average about his ability to handle his office. As one historian said, if you're great, you can't be average. For us, the important thing about Truman is that by understanding his presidency, we begin to understand the world we live in today. We see why we are in Korea, why we got involved in Vietnam, invaded Grenada, or send military aid to Central America. We know the beginning of the nuclear arms race, America's special relationship with Israel, its support of NATO, and our preoccupation with the Cold War. Truman set the guidelines for today's presidential actions. He left us quite a legacy. Harry Truman would be 100 years old this year. This is Walter Cronkite. Good night.
Look who's entered the personal computer game now.
Can I get in on this?
Go ahead. Introducing the AT&T Personal Computer for Business. It's fast and flexible, runs most business software, and has a high-resolution screen for superb graphics. In short, everything you need to put your business ahead of the game.
Your move.
The AT&T Personal Computer. Call AT&T Information Systems when you've got to be right.
The 1932 $10 gold piece. Today, this coin is worth up to $4,000. And remember this 35 silver dollar? This one is now worth $1,900. For the first time, you can buy Olympic gold and silver coins from the U.S. Treasury. These coins won't be made after this year. No one knows what they'll be worth tomorrow. But since they help pay for Olympic training, they're worth a fortune today. Support the home team. Buy an Olympic coin at many banks, coin dealers, fine stores, savings and loans, and post offices.
Tell the truth. Is there a really great tasting decaffeinated coffee?
Oh, yes. Taster's Choice Decaffeinated. It's made with the same superior Arabica beans found in gourmet coffee stores. Carefully roasted and using only natural decaffeinators for the purest coffee taste. Only Taster's Choice uses this gourmet blend, Arabica Supreme. The more you know about coffee, the more you'll know why the choice for taste is Taster's Choice.
Arthritis. For minor arthritis pain, this is the arthritis medicine. Ecotrin. Proven safer for your stomach, so it's better than plain or buffered aspirin. Safety-coated Ecotrin. Now recommended by more arthritis specialists than any other pain reliever you can buy. Ecotrin. Tablets, capsules. Ecotrin, the arthritis medicine.
Saturday night, two men sacrifice everything for the Olympic gold, except their honor. Ben Cross and Ian Charleston star in the Academy Award-winning Chariots of Fire. Saturday night at 8:30, 7:30 Central and Mountain.
Tonight, the delegates cast their ballots. The Democrats decide. Join Dan Rather for CBS News coverage of the Democratic Convention next.
Thursday.
No more baggy underwear!
And no more places to hide when Magnum uncovers a desperate killer from the past.
Can't you see you've been set up?
Thursday.
Good evening from CBS News. This is Newsbreak. In San Ysidro, California, a gunman opened fire inside a McDonald's restaurant. At least 10 people have been killed. The gunman is still holding some people hostage inside. President Reagan signed a bill today that includes $50 billion in tax increases and $13 billion in spending reductions. The cuts will come mainly from social programs, particularly Medicare. Reversing a sharp decline in May, housing construction starts increased 5.3% in June. Now this.
Digel tops plain antacids. Digel not only consumes heartburn-producing acid, it has the yellow top, relieves gas, too. Digel tops plain antacids.
Britain and Argentina began their first official talks on the Falkland Islands since their war over the disputed territory in 1982. Unification Church founder Reverend Sun Myung Moon lost his last appeal and has been ordered to begin an 18-month prison term Friday for income tax evasion. Democrats will nominate their candidate for president tonight following a speech by Senator Gary Hart. I'm Marlene Sanders, CBS News, New York. CBS News convention coverage is next.
This is CBS.
It's back-to-school sale time at Salesman Sample Outlet with many money-saving back-to-school specials. For example, Levi bootcut and straight-leg jeans, $13.90 and $14.90. Levi fashion saddleman jeans, $14.90. Short-sleeve knit shirts, 35% off regular retail. Tube socks in solids and colors, package of 6 pair, just $6.90. Plus many other back-to-school values now during the back-to-school sale at Salesman Sample Outlet, 4306 Memorial Drive in Waco.
$449. That's right, $449 for this Zenith video recorder. We think it's America's greatest video value. I'm James Cook, inviting you to see Waco's best selection of Zenith video recorders. And our low overhead downtown showroom means you pay less. Choose from portables, models with special effects, all with Zenith's quality and our reputation for service. That's Cook Electronics Center, 1020 Austin Avenue, downtown.
Excerpts from Gary Hart's speech to the convention on the late news.
Live from Moscone Convention Center in San Francisco, CBS News coverage of the Democratic National Convention. This portion is sponsored by AT&T. We're reaching out in new directions. By General Motors. Extra time, extra effort, and attention to every detail. GM is committed to excellence. and by Sun Company. Where there's sun, there's energy. And now from CBS News Convention Headquarters, here is Dan Rather.
Good evening. If last night was Jesse Jackson's night here at the Democratic Party Convention, this is Walter Mondale's night. A hard day's night to capture what he once thought he had in the snows of New Hampshire, a first ballot presidential nomination. Tonight's the night the months of Mondale bashing, at least by other Democrats, is supposed to end in a Mondale bash. A united party behind one candidate, united for November. But not so fast. First, there is Gary Hart's speech tonight. In a few moments, Hart is scheduled to address this convention. The question is, will he call for unity as Jesse Jackson did last night?